thank you everyone for coming, and thank you very much to the organisers for having this paper on the programme. My name is Natalie, and this is joint work with Michele Andrioli and my advisor Paolo Sirico, who are both also at London Business School. I'll just start by saying that this is fairly early stage preliminary work, so we'd really appreciate any feedback or suggestions that you have. Some stuff is still work in progress. So the starting point for this project is that the first response to a contraction, be that a individual level, household level contraction where they're facing, say, unemployment, or to a macroeconomic contraction, is for households to cut non-essential consumption. So not all consumption is made equal. There's certain types of consumption which you probably just want to keep on consuming, whereas there's certain things that you can probably cut back on. So for example, you might be quite willing to forego a foreign holiday, or say going out to a meal out at a restaurant, but you might still need to pay for utilities. You probably want to still keep paying for your heating bill every day and not put that off to the following winter. We saw a couple of quite vivid examples of this recently. So one is during the COVID lockdowns, where we really legally formalised some of these distinctions between the types of consumption that we are willing to forego and the ones that we're not. So of course, some of the sectors that we shut down during COVID lockdowns were ones that were maybe more exposed to COVID and had higher disease risk, but quite a lot of it was due to what we thought we could forego during the pandemic. So we kept supermarkets open, for instance. We can also see this during the current cost of living crisis with the response that people have to their rise in living costs. So this is the results of a recent household survey run by the UK's Office of National Statistics over this summer of households who were seeing their costs of living increase. And what you can see from this is that the most popular response to a rise in the cost of living was to spend less on non-essential consumption. So 57% of people plan to spend less on non-essentials. This is despite the fact that the rise in prices was primarily driven by things like energy prices, to some extent food prices, but the substitution away from those types of goods is somewhat less important in this survey. So 51% of people planning to use less fuel, such as gas or electricity, or to 35% to spend less on food shopping and essentials. So despite the fact those are the things that their prices are rising, they're planning to spend less on non-essential consumption. Now, of course, this may not be particularly surprising, but we just want to note this as something that maybe isn't taken into account when you have one overall consumption bundle in a macro model. What I also want to emphasize is that non-essential consumption is specifically easier to postpone. So it's not just when you have a permanent drop in consumption that you permanently shift your consumption bundle, but specifically that these types of goods are easier to intertemporally substitute. So you're quite willing to put your holiday, rather than this year, spend it to next year, or you're quite willing to go on your meal out to a restaurant in a month's time or a couple of months' time, but you really do need to keep on spending on grocery bills or indeed heating. Okay, so maybe you've got a consumption bundle switch, but why do we really care? Why does this matter for macroeconomic dynamics? And why is this not just that we're just sort of shifting the consumption bundle? Useful to know, but not necessarily important. We're going to argue in this paper that there's potentially general equilibrium consequences of this consumption bundle shifting. So there's two potential effects of people cutting back on non-essentials. The first is that non-essential prices might well fall relatively compared to essential prices. So you've got less demand for these non-essentials, maybe their prices fall relatively more. Secondly, we might see that employment and earnings in non-essential industries falls relatively more. There's reduced output, less demand in these industries, and so you get maybe some layoffs, maybe a reduction in earnings growth in these industries. We're going to actually find that this second mechanism is much more important than the first one in our empirical evidence. Now, these two potential effects are important because both effects are likely to hurt low-income households more than richer households. So on the first point on prices, essential consumption is a larger share of their consumption bundle. And so if you have a relative price fall of non-essential prices, that means a relative price rise of essential prices. And so that's going to work against lower income households. As I said, I think that's a fairly minor point in our mechanism. What's much more important is the low-income households are much more likely to work in non-essential industries, which is a fairly novel empirical fact that we show in this paper. And so they're more exposed to this drop in employment and earnings in the non-essential industries. This fact that it's hurting the low-income households more has the scope to potentially amplify the effect of a shock if these low-income households have higher marginal propensities to consume, which is a fact that's reasonably fair in the recent empirical evidence, regardless of whether that's really driven by financial constraints or by income. So just to sort of visualize this sort of amplification mechanism that we're describing here, starting with the yellow circle on the left, given an aggregate demand reduction, this then leads to a reduction in household income, and because of the heterogeneity in sort of spending decisions, this particularly leads to a reduction in non-essential spending. Now, bringing in heterogeneity across firms, this cut in non-essential spending leads to a cut in non-essential firms' labour demand. And this particularly hurts the earnings of low-income workers because they work in these sectors. And so the earnings of low-income workers are hit even more than the initial drop in household income. Now, because these low-income workers have higher MPCs, this leads to a higher fall in aggregate spending as they amplify the shock, leading to a general amplification effect. So just what I'm going to do today, we're going to focus in particular in this project on monetary policy, partly because we've got some very nicely approaches to empirically identifying the effects of monetary policy, and because it's a particularly important element, of course, of the macroeconomic transmission mechanism. We're going to firstly use disaggregated data to try and find some empirical support for these mechanisms that I've just outlined. And then secondly, and this is still a work in progress, we're going to propose a two-agent New Keynesian model with non-homothetic preferences to try and flesh out some of the theoretical mechanisms and the implications of this.
I'm not going to say something very constructive, but essentiality is not a policy variable nor an institution. It's a fact of life, right? So it's unclear what thought experiment you are doing when you say, essentials, non-essentials matter. Right? There is no feasible counterfactual world where essential things are not essential or vice versa.
Yeah. So, yeah, of course. Yeah, it's maybe something just.
Maybe it amplifies the business cycle, but relative to a counterfactual which is not, which is virtual. Right?
Yeah, that's certainly true. So it might be particularly for monetary policy something more to be aware of and to understand the transmission rather than something that you can really do something about. Potentially for fiscal policy, it's a little bit different. Like as we saw in COVID lockdowns, you can maybe start to target support at certain sectors, but that's not really the role of our paper. Our role of the paper is just to really flesh out this mechanism. But yeah, point well taken, thank you.
So related to that, maybe you're going to discuss that. If you're going to discuss it, okay, don't have to go through that. Essential sector, my impression is that if you take groceries and usually it's low-income people in those sectors, but here you seem to suggest that in non-essential sector is low-income people. Maybe I'm missing something there. Yeah.
So certainly there are some sectors where you might think that there's more low-income people, but it's sort of as a counterexample to the grocery sector that you gave, we could also say that like waiters are in a non-essential sector, they tend to be quite low paid. So there's examples on either side, and there's certainly an income distribution within both. I'll show you that in a second. But yeah, thank you.
I don't know if you have cross-country evidence, but it would be interesting to see if a poorer country has a different share of essential versus non-essential, and what that should imply for the volatility of the business cycles. So if it's true that these facts hold relative to the income, not just within the country, relative income, but across countries, then you could have a reason why certain poorer countries might have more volatile business cycle on the consumption side.
Yeah. So I think that this is probably going to conclude that poorer countries are have less volatile business cycles, which is potentially counterintuitive because as you get richer, you have a higher share of non-essentials, which are more volatile. At the moment, we've just looked at the US, but yeah, definitely extending it to other countries and seeing what it means for developing economies. It's potentially that, you know, in developing economies, we probably wouldn't expect a less volatile business cycle, but just that this mechanism is maybe less important for them. But yeah, certainly something that we'd like to look at.
Sorry, can you try to rephrase this question? What's the difference between these cyclical properties of some component of demand? I know that some components are more cyclical. Is this because it's asymmetric when you look at contraction?
We see it as symmetric. So when I'm saying that they
certain parts of the demand are, and maybe inspired by weight loss, you with the essential labor goods, but it's just the cyclicality of demand, right?
Yeah. So this is, to some extent, that many of our mechanisms would go through if you just said this is a more cyclical part of demand, and we're just giving a particular rationale for why this bit of demand is more cyclical. So you could just, I don't want to say this too strongly because my co-authors might object, but you could omit the essentials and you could just say cyclical, and many of the labour market implications that we're going to explore would run through similarly. We think that this is quite a useful rationale, particularly because of the relationship between the essentialness and the intertemporal elasticity of substitution, that it's a bit more novel to focus on this.
It would be like a way to structure the cyclicality argument.
Yeah, exactly.
Just to go into its direction.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions? So I'm just going to skip briefly over the related literature, of which some highlights are up here. So this relates closely to a wide range and very long literature on non-homothetic preferences, both theoretical literature and literature that relates to a range of fields of different fields in economics. We're sort of taking the view that maybe this is underexplored in the business cycle literature. We're going to build on the literature of identification of effects of monetary policy, and specifically we're going to use the work of Gertler and Corradi, their high-frequency identification approach. And then finally it relates to a large literature, recent literature on heterogeneity and the role of heterogeneity in business cycles and monetary policy. What this paper is kind of doing is it's sort of an interplay between the heterogeneity of business cycle literature and the non-homothetic demand literature. And in particular, relative to some of the papers that do explore heterogeneity in different consumption goods, we think that our role is really to flesh out some of the labour market implications of these heterogeneities. Okay, so the first challenge of this project is just to define what exactly a non-essential consumption good is and construct a new series splitting employment, consumption and prices into essentials and non-essentials. So what we're going to do is we're going to define non-essentials as any goods with an income elasticity of demand greater than 1. And then we're going to estimate some IEDs for different consumption categories. Now, clearly, there's a massive literature estimating Engel curves and income elasticities of demand, so we're not going to reinvent the wheel here. And we're just going to use the approach of a recent paper by Aguar and Bills, 2015, in the AER, where, among other things, they estimate income elasticities of demand using CEX data for a wide range of consumption categories. The results of this are in this table here. So among essentials, there are some fairly intuitive things like food at home and utilities, the examples that I gave earlier. Among non-essentials, there are things like entertainment equipment, food away from home, out at restaurants, travel, new car purchases, owner-occupied housing. So hopefully some of this seems fairly intuitive. Happy to go into the details. What we do then is we take these consumption categories provided by the CEX and we map them onto personal consumption expenditure data in the US. Yes?
Just one question.
Yes.
Interest payments are in essentials or non-essentials?
Interest
payment, because it's relatively constraining on some low-income households.
Yes, of course. So in the CEX, we tend to omit quite a lot of sort of financial services variables because it's unclear in the survey data whether they are sort of saving or if they are sort of expenditure, if that makes sense. Yeah. Sorry, if they're interest payments or if they are paying off, they're actually saving. So we don't have too much on that. Obviously, owner-occupied housing consumption is quite a big portion of interest rate payments, and that is classified as a...
Because it's part of the counterpart of rent.
Yeah,
You have no rent, so you have interest payments eventually.
But yeah, we sort of, it's a little bit hard to deal with that using this language. Yes.
A quick question regarding the categorization. You could also just look at the expenditure shares of the top 10% relative to the bottom 10%, right? Is this what the methodology is implicitly doing?
That's roughly what they're doing, So they basically regress the deviation in the expenditure share on expenditure and equity. So that's effectively what they're doing, So we map these consumption categories into personal consumption expenditure from the national accounts in the US, and that's quite helpful because it gives us a very long time series of consistent consumption categorizations, and it also gives consumption and price series separately, so it's quite helpful versus the CEX household data.
These goods are not, these items are not goods. I mean, owner-occupied housing is the same thing as rental housing. And food away from home, that's food, right?
So we've got both goods and services here. What we're trying to, I guess, say is that you can potentially price these goods differently if it's food at home versus food away from home, and that there'll be different types of employees in these different sectors. So going back to the example before, there's grocery workers and waiters, which have quite distinct jobs and potentially have different labour market outcomes, even if there's the same raw good. I'll come back to that and discuss with you further. So having constructed now a series using the PCE data, we then have to turn to a labour market classification. Now this is slightly more challenging because we can classify final consumption goods provided by final consumption industries quite straightforwardly. So the example of restaurants, we can classify the waiters in the restaurant as non-essential workers. But we also want to be able to classify the upstream effects of this demand cyclicality for intermediate industries. So what we do there is we take the Leontief inverse of the input-output matrix to try and sort of unpack where this downstream demand is coming from for intermediate industries. So again, going back to the example of restaurants, a vineyard is primarily supplying wine to either alcohol to consume at home, which is a non-essential, or to a restaurant, which is also a non-essential. So we would classify the workers in the vineyard as also a non-essential worker. Not everything is quite as straightforward as that particular example, but this production network approach aims to sort of unpack that and work out what the downstream demand cyclicality is primarily coming from. We then use this industry classification and we classify workers in the CPS as essential or non-essential, and use that to construct employment and earnings series for essentials and non-essentials. So to give an idea of what this then looks like, here are two series for consumption growth on the left-hand side and employment growth on the right-hand side. Non-essentials are in red and essentials are in green. And what I hope you can maybe see from these charts is that the non-essentials appear to be more pro-cyclical and more volatile than the essential series. So during the shaded bars, the MBR recession dates, non-essential consumption and employment falls relatively more, and during the expansion periods, non-essential consumption and to a lesser extent employment also appears to grow a bit faster. To complement this sort of eyeballing econometrics, there's a business cycle table underneath, which sort of puts numbers on some of these facts. So consumption and employment in non-essentials appear to be more correlated with industrial production, particularly for employment, less so for consumption. And also in terms of the standard deviations relative to industrial production, consumption and employment in non-essentials are relatively more volatile than in essential sectors. So takeaway is that broadly non-essentials appear to be more volatile and pro-cyclical. These charts are just for before COVID. Obviously, after COVID, this really explodes. I've taken that out of the charts because it's very then hard to see the effects of after COVID. But you see a similar effect as these distinctions are formalized during lockdowns. The second thing I want to note is the earnings distributions in these two sectors. So this shows the median earnings in the dashed line and then a kernel density plot of the distributions for non-essentials and essentials. Non-essentials again are in red and essentials are in green. And what you can take away from this chart is not only is that the essential median wage is higher than in non-essentials, but also across the entire distribution, there's actually first-order stochastic dominance of these distributions. So non-essential workers appear to be paid less than essential workers. So going back to your point earlier, it's true that there are certain essential workers that are in the low end of the income distribution, but overall it appears that non-essential workers are paid less. Yeah.
How do you classify? So it was not clear from
Yeah. So we've got certain sectors which are quite hard to classify using the consumption data, because what exactly like a final consumer is paying for financial services is quite hard to gather from the survey data. So those types of sectors we actually exclude. So financial services is a good example of one where
management of this sector. So those I think is difficult to classify.
IT specifically, I think because it's often an intermediate good, it goes through this sort of unpacking of the production network. I think it ended up being a non-essential good, but I'd have to double check that definitely. But yeah, it depends on how much of an intermediate good it is. So moving on from this sort of more descriptive statistics, we're then going to use an empirical approach to identify the effects of monetary policy. And here we're going to use the high-frequency monetary policy instrument, which is an updated version of that from Gertler and Corradi. And we're specifically going to use that monetary policy instrument within a proxy SVAR and extract from that the monetary policy surprise series, following some of the literature, including my co-author Paolo's recent restud. That allows us to have a longer surprise series than the original monetary policy instrument because it's been fed through the proxy SVAR. We're then going to use this monetary policy surprise series within a smooth local projection approach. So the monetary policy surprise series is going to instrument the one-year yield here. We're specifically going to use a smoothing approach proposed by Barnentron and Brownlee's 2019, which penalizes the shape of the IRF given by beta IH towards a more smooth IRF. So rather than in standard local projections, you get a jagged local projection. This improves the efficiency of the local projection estimates by smoothing it towards a smooth polynomial. And some recent work by Lee, Plagborg, Muller, and Wolf suggests that this is a sort of improvement over using the basic local projections approach. We're also going to use a range of largely standard controls and the maximum possible sample given our data availability. We've also tested for robustness of a few changes in these empirical decisions. So turning to the results, here's firstly the results of consumption. On the left, you've got the aggregate consumption response, and the second and the third chart show the essential and non-essential consumption response. And what I hope you can see from these charts is that essential consumption appears to fall less than non-essential consumption. So essential consumption falls about 0.5% in response to a 100 basis point contractionary monetary policy shock, whereas non-essential consumption falls more than 1% over a 1 to 3 year horizon. The final chart on the right-hand side is where we use the log of the ratio between the series just to show the statistical significance in the difference between the series, because you can't just compare the confidence intervals of the level series directly. And what that shows is that this relative decline in non-essential consumption is statistically significant over much of the IRF horizon. So again, this seems to, yes.
We looked into how much of this is durable versus non-durable.
Yes. I might get into a bit more detail during the robustness check section, but there is a correlation between non-essentials and durables. There's a much higher proportion of durables within non-essentials. Because durables are quite a small portion of the consumption bundle, what we can do is we can just exclude all durables and see if the results still run through for non-durables, and they do. The results are attenuated a little bit, but the results still hold. There's a couple of reasons why we think that this is like an important and separate channel. The first is that that result on distributions of earnings is not the same for durables versus non-durables. So actually, durables versus non-durables have a pretty similar earnings distribution. It's only non-essentials that have this quite distinct heterogeneity. But yeah, happy to discuss that a bit more in detail. We've done a lot of work because that's like a common difference. Moving on to prices, we've got much weaker results on the price effect. So of an insignificant decline in aggregate prices, it appears that essential prices rise somewhat, but insignificantly, following a contractionary shock, whereas non-essential prices fall, but again, insignificantly. And the right-hand side chart shows the relative response between these two variables. And again, it's only barely significant, although you do get some slight significance on the relative response. So what this suggests to us is that this price channel was relatively weak, and in fact, instead, it's the labour market channel that's taking the bulk of the effect. So as I said, our employment responses are overall much stronger. So of the aggregate, around 1% decline in aggregate employment, essentials employment barely responds. So essentials employment declines very slightly, but insignificantly across the entire horizon. And instead, non-essentials employment appears to take the bulk of the decline in aggregate employment and accounts for almost all of the employment decline. Again, on the right-hand side, we've got the relative responses of these two series, and this is highly statistically significant as well as, quite a large difference. This response of the labour market is also reflected to some extent in earnings, but because our earnings series are a bit more noisy, these results are a bit weaker and we've got much wider standard errors. So median earnings appear to decline by about 3% by the end of our horizon, but this is much smaller for essential earnings, which only fall about 1%, versus non-essential earnings, which fall much more. Again, because of the noisiness of the series, these differences are only slightly statistically significant, but quite large nonetheless. What's notable about these earnings responses is that they seem to be primarily driven by the bottom of the earnings distribution in non-essentials. So here what we've plotted is the point estimates of the EIEFs for different percentiles of the earnings distributions for non-essentials and essentials. So we go through over time and we work out what the 20th percentile is for the essentials distribution, and we calculate the EIEF of that. So on the left-hand side, it appears that most of the percentiles sort of move in tandem, quite similarly across the earnings distribution. Whereas on the right-hand side, the non-essential earnings percentiles at the bottom of the distribution really fall. So the 20% and 40% are really taking the bulk of this. This is another sort of reframing of that graph with some actual confidence intervals. So here we've taken the point of 2 years after the shock. Again, left-hand side is the response of earnings non-essential percentiles, and the right-hand side is the response of non-essentials. And what you can see is that the essential percentiles decline slightly, but insignificantly, whereas there's a pretty sharp gradient on the non-essential percentile response, where it's the bottom of the distribution which seems to be being hit the hardest. Now, we haven't really got a micro foundation for either why this is happening or why there's a general correlation between income and non-essential workers. But we do suggest that this is sort of a potential partial explanation for some of the counter-cyclicality of income inequality, which has been found in the data recently. Yes?
Include after COVID data in this analysis?
So this analysis has 2 months of COVID data, partly because of path dependence of the project. If you exclude entirely COVID, then these results are the same, if not very slightly stronger on the earnings.
They're not driven by the COVID results.
But these aren't at all driven by the COVID section of the data. Thank you. So here I've just got some back of the envelope calculations to summarize some of the amplification provided by non-essentials. So the first 3 columns have the average annual impact, sort of more in levels, averaged over the entire 4-year EIEF horizon that we've estimated. So what this says is that of the $200, just over $200 decline in consumption per capita, this is made up of $120 roughly of non-essentials and $70 of essentials. Similarly for employment, of the 700,000 drop in jobs, this is made up almost not at all of essential employment and of 690,000 of non-essential jobs lost. So really, it's very heavily non-essentials that are driving these average impacts over time.
This seems to suggest it's not operating through consumption, really, because the difference in employment is so huge while consumption.
Yeah. So we're looking to explore this a little bit more in the data, but we've got
because we've got this transmission mechanism back through consumption of low-income households, so we've got this process of the low-income households' employment is hit and then they reduce their consumption, it's reasonable for them to then reduce essential consumption quite a lot because they are low income and that's a larger proportion of their consumption. So it's potentially one potential explanation for this like relative difference that we've got is that these low-income households are then dropping essential consumption and they're mediating the difference in the consumption response. We're still that's something that we can only really do with the model, which we're working on at the moment, to try and understand that. But yeah, there is quite a discrepancy in the sizes of things.
It looks like there is more labor holding in the essentials.
Yes.
So is it because there is more manufacturing in the essentials and manufacturing has fixed cost of production, so you do more labor holding or whatever?
Yeah, I don't think we've actually explicitly tested manufacturing. We've looked at the differences, say, between goods and services. But yeah, that's
nuclear plant. Is electricity essential?
Electricity is essential, yeah. So
they might have to shut down a nuclear plant just because there is a recession.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But maybe that proves our point because you can't stop consuming electricity, so these guys have to keep.
Well, or maybe you reduce the production of electricity, but you don't really fire the people. You don't lay off the people because
you need to have
because of the technology.
But I would say it's more like a result of hiring and firing costs or something else.
Yeah.
The demand, recomposition of demand.
Yes.
Right.
Actually, Natalie, sorry.
Yes.
You probably are aware that there's a paper by Cristiano Pantore and authors.
Yes.
Finding exactly the opposite, right? So after monetary policy shocks, the hours that are falling, actually, at the bottom of the income distribution, hours are going up rather than down.
Yeah. So that maybe,
we've sort of discussed that paper and we're still trying to work out how it sort of interplays with this one. But yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions?
Okay, so on the differences on the term side, right? These non-essential terms are like more capital intensive, more financially constrained. They might be cutting employees for many reasons. Most of them are
yeah.
I don't know if you have any data on that.
Yeah. We primarily, so a general sort of challenge for us is that we don't exactly have exogenous variation in non-essentials and essentials with everything else in all of the industries and the consumption goods the same. So what we've done to try and address these types of issues is just look at the correlation between non-essentials and essentials. We've primarily focused on consumption goods in that, but yeah, you're right. We should sort of look a bit more at the correlation in the industry side as well with other characteristics to see how much that's driving it. Yeah, it's a slight sort of challenge for our approach, but yeah, we'll take that on board and definitely.
Sorry, did you try to look also at the tradable, non-tradable distinction?
Yes.
Because also the price of essential for me, the paper I wrote on college is production. So there was an input-output analysis for essential, which is a different thing. And that, of course, the employment does not move much there, exactly because they're essential.
Yes.
But for Rebel and others, the cyclicality goes into labor intensity. Remember, there is this paper where they look at how the gap in consumption is hierarchically structured with labor intensity, so that they will display. So again, I find the essential and consumption a little bit confusing, as other people said. But I wonder whether this tradable, non-tradable distinction, for example, may have also for the price result.
So we did have a look at tradables, non-tradables on the suggestion of one of my colleagues at LBS. And we found that there was a very low correlation between our consumption classification of essentials and non-essentials with tradables and non-tradables. There's almost the same proportion of tradables within essentials and non-essentials. That's just on consumption though, so yeah, we still need to extend that to the sort of more the labour side. And so we think that this is probably, we're reasonably confident that this is separate from the distinction between tradables and non-tradables, but yeah, it's definitely something to maybe do a bit more work on. Thank you. Okay.
So just on robustness, it maybe touches on some of the points that some of you raised. We've checked that the results hold using Jarosinski and Corradi shocks, which take into account the information effect that may present an identification problem with using Gertler and Corradi shocks. We've tried to check that this is not confounded with some of the other consumption characteristics that you've mentioned, so durables and non-durables, we check tradables, non-tradables, goods and services, and we think that there's either a low correlation or that this is driving separately within one of the categories. We checked alternative samples, including omitting COVID, using standard local projections and some alternative approaches to industry classification. But of course, very open to any other suggestions, and of course taking on board some of your, yes.
Related to previous comments, is it possible that you have in your different sectors different shares of labor and capital, or different degrees of substitution between labor and capital, so that the reaction to a shock on, for instance, price of capital differs from one sector to the other? Because if it is really, as you assume, as you try to show, a demand shock, we should find a stronger effect on prices. While if it's an effect on one of the capital factor of production, you may have an effect which is stronger on wages, basically, because the sector is more affected because of a shock on another factor, and not directly an effect on prices. That's a bit a devil advocate question. But
yeah, no, of course. So just on the employment intensity, it does appear that non-essentials are a bit more employment intensive, which might speak to what you say. I don't think we've sufficiently necessarily ruled out that as a channel. There isn't a strong reason, though, why there isn't necessarily a similar elasticity of substitution between capital and labour, I think. But I think I'll have to give that a little bit more thought. Yeah, because it... Yeah.
5 minutes.
Cool. So I'm only going to very briefly discuss the model, partly because this is a work in progress, but just to give an indication of where we're going. So what we plan to do next is add non-homothetic preferences to a two-agent New Keynesian model, where we have two types of goods, so essential goods, which are CE, and non-essential goods, which are CN. And this distinction between these two types of goods is the intertemporal elasticity of substitution for these two goods, which is gamma E and gamma M. And a fairly general property of non-homothetic preferences is that the good with the higher intertemporal elasticity of substitution tends to also have an higher income elasticity of demand. So is by definition a luxury good. So going back to the example before, again, you're quite willing to delay your restaurant consumption, but you're not willing to delay your consumption of food at home. This particular type of preferences that we've chosen here was suggested by Browning and Crosley 2000, who proved that this sort of relationship between the IES and the IED is just captured by one particular parameter, which is gamma E. What we then plan to do is add these non-homothetic preferences into a two-agent New Keynesian model, where we've got two types of workers that try to reflect some of the empirical facts that we found. So low productivity hand-to-mouth households who work in the non-essential sector, and high productivity Ricardian households who work in the essential sector, with the rest of the model being fairly standard and consistent with standard New Keynesian models. So firms who face Calvo frictions and a government who sets interest rates according to a table. Now, I'm not going to give sort of proper IRFs here because we're still working on the calibration and some of the aspects of this model, but we generally find that qualitatively this model fits some of the data that we've just shown. So non-essential consumption declines relatively more for both types of households. Labour and wages of poor workers decline more because they work in more cyclical non-essential sector, and the consumption of these poor hand-to-mouth households declines relatively more. But we've got a bit more work to work out, to use the model to flesh out some of the mechanisms and the policy implications of this.
Yes, you define your essentialness on the basis of cross-sectional income elasticities.
Yes.
I mean, now you say, oh, they actually correlate very strongly with substitutability. Across time. Isn't the substitutability across time a more fundamental notion of essentialness? I mean, even if I don't spend more on something when I get richer, the question is how much can I in the short run substitute away from it or not?
Yeah.
Isn't that what defines essentialness?
So this result by Browning and Cosley suggests that they equally define essentialness. So it would be equally valid to look at the intertemporal substitutability or equally valid to look at the cross-sectional.
To the extent that the correlation is perfect, you could try to define your essential sectors in a different way.
Yeah, yeah.
I guess as long as the utility is time separable, you cannot really define the two independently. But maybe for more general utility, intertemporal substitution is different from.
But in the data, you look at the short run versus the. If you look at the time series dimension and the consumption shares of different categories across time, and over the business cycle, how much they vary, and define essentialness in that way, no?
Yeah.
For a given income group in the CEF.
Yeah. So we certainly could. We could go the other direction to what we did, where we sort of started with the cross-sectional and said this is what it implies for intertemporal substitutability in those consumption IRFs. You could go backwards and look at what's most cyclical, and therefore, you know, does this also correlate with income? That was also something we explored, but we just found that this approach using the cross-sectional data seemed to just, you know, give a more precise estimate of what is an essential or non-essential relative to the sort of IRF approach of different consumption categories. But yeah, to some extent, that you could also do that approach. We hope that our IRFs have sort of shown that we're doing, that the intertemporal substitutability definition is still sort of present in our classification. Okay, I'm a little over time, so I'll just wrap up. It seems that not following a contractionary shock, non-essential consumption, prices, employment, and earnings falls more. This appears to disproportionately affect low-income households, having the scope to amplify a contractionary shock. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to discuss the paper. It was a great presentation. Many questions. You did this hard very well. Congratulations. So what is the paper about? Well, the paper is about sort of related to the next one. It's sectoral effects of the monetary policy, right? And so here the point is very simple in some ways. Like some sectors have a high intertemporal substitution, so they are easier to postpone. And it happens to be the case in the data that those sectors are the ones hiring more people, the poorer or low-skilled workers, right? So you can see how a monetary policy shock affects, through these non-essentials, affects most of the bottom of the distribution. Okay, that is more or less the point. Let me say that it's I don't know, she didn't do justice to all the empirical work. There is a lot of work in there. It's beautiful, and I think they do a great job documenting all these effects around here. So the question is, what I'm going to try to do, and I think there were many questions around here, is what is different about other things, right? And everyone was asking. And then what the data tells you more or less about the model. They don't have a model yet. They are trying to work out about that. So let's see what the data can tell us about that. And everyone was asking about that. What is essential? What is not essential? Okay? So, and I can tell you here, I must confess that before doing my PhD, I used to work for the evil private sector, a think tank. It was the Chilean Chamber of Construction. So we were thinking about these issues all the time, right? Especially with construction, which is a durable. Okay? And there you can see more or less what is the classification of essential and non-essential with the adjusted elasticity. Okay? So some things to notice is like there is an issue about suppose public transportation, right? It's not essential, right? And it's 4% of this, which sounds a bit weird, right? You may think that the public transportation is essential. I don't know. My suspicion is that maybe they're putting plane tickets, airfare, which is not essential. While taking the bus, you may think it's essential because you need to. And that's, I wanted to make that point because sometimes you want to think about essential and not essential. You have to think about within, always people tell me that I shout a lot, and today nobody hears me. Okay, so one thing that I want to say about that is maybe the distinction between essential and non-essential is within the sectors and it's not across the sectors, okay? So 1 point. The other point is, if you look at the non-essentials, and people raise this question, you see, let me point some things, entertainment and equipment. Okay, we're talking about IT, probably it's in there. That is durable. Let's talk about, household appliances. That's durable. Let's talk about furniture and fixtures. That is durable. Let's talk about, I don't know, education. I hope it's durable. I hope my PhD is not going to depreciate that fast. And I can think about, you have owner-occupied housing and consumption. There is an issue, how do you measure that consumption? But you have to think housing is durable. Okay? And you have many things like that. Even, I could go as far as saying sometimes clothing, My wife always complained to me, I think this shirt is like 5 years old, and it's durable, right? And sometimes, if you want to postpone something, you can postpone. You don't need to buy new shoes, and there are many things. The question is how you define as durable, not or essential or non-essential. In my calculation, around you have the consumption shares in there. 70% of the non-essential is durable. So my point is, they say in some way, I don't know how to classify that they say the less of half or not the minority are durable. I guess you can define durable and non-durable in different way. I would say that everything that I put in durable, I think has some component of durability. Okay? So why is this important? Because you have, what is the response? If you have a non-durable good, I mean, the non-durable good you're consuming is more or less following your income. While if you have a durable, when you have a shock, what happens is that you have a stock, and then you adjust immediately the flow, right? Because your target stock changed, and then there is a jump in your stock. And that will be a different reaction. You will say a higher fall on impact of a shock for a durable, while by the non-durable, you will see something different. Okay? So let me, and here is the impulse responses that they show. Okay, so you have aggregate consumption. You can look at these are the two figures, the essential consumption and the non-essential consumption. And it's true that the non-essential consumption falls more on impact, but if you see in the long run, it's exactly the same. Okay, it's exactly the same fall. Okay, there is an issue with the prices. So far, it seems to me like the median response is more or less the same for essential and at least in the definition that they have. So that will tell me that more or less the elasticity substitution of the sigma or the gammas, I think they call it in the paper, should be the same. Actually, this is simple. If we are not durables, the allocation is an intratemporal first-order condition. You can compute what will be the relationship between the elasticities, right? And then a lot is going to depend on the prices. It's a lot what happens with the price. I spent a lot of time trying to figure it out. I couldn't. There are many things that you can do with the prices, right? But the point is, depending on what happens with the prices, is what is the reaction that you see in the non-essential. So it could be that they have different gammas or different intertemporal elasticities, but because the prices are changing in a particular way, you see the long run elasticity is the same. It could be still, there is a differential reactions, but then you have to think about the production sector. You have to see how the prices are being settled, what is the difference between flexibility, what is the possibility for reallocation. There are some sectors that are more rigid than others, and so on. And then I thought, okay, maybe it's the prices what is giving you this long-term, medium-term reaction that is the same. But then they have in the appendix, they have the impulse responses for durables and not durables between essential and non-essential. And if you see here on the top, you have the consumption, you have the aggregate. In the middle, you have the non-durables. Okay? If you see something interesting in the medium room, the non-essential, non-durable seems to fall less. Exactly in the middle, look in the middle row, exactly the middle picture, that is the non-durable essential fall. Next to it, in the middle row, the last one in the right, is the non-durable, non-essential. And you see at the end, the non-durable, non-essential is 0.5 below. The non-durable essential is below that, more close to 1%. And if you look at the durables, that is exactly the last row, you see that it's similar pattern. Again, it seems to be that the durable, non-essential, reacts less than the durable essential. So if you take it part by part, you take non-durables and durables, the impulse response of the non-essential seems to be less than the essential. Okay, so then you wonder how much of this effect is due to the composition, different composition. That the non-essential is like, at least in my calculation, 70% durable versus the essential is, I think it's 10% durable, okay? And you see also here, you see that the durables, what I was telling you at the beginning, you see a higher fall, you see a fall on impact after the shock. While with the non-durables, even essential or non-essential, you don't see the fall on impact, okay? So that is the thing that is more or less gonna be all. Let me go. Okay, yeah, why is this important? Because it depends how you model it. And also there is another issue. These durables have a credit component. They're credit goods. Okay, and so when you're doing interest rate shocks, as they're doing, there is a direct effect on there. It's not just, you cannot compare the shock in the durable and not durable, because definitely the people cannot buy it, right? Or it's less likely they can buy it. So, in short, I think it's very nice. There is a lot of work, believe me. I think there is a very nice matching between across sectors. There is the very nice estimations to see how these shocks propagate across sectors. But I think one important point of the paper to sell it is that you had to make this distinction between non-essential and other particular characteristics like durable very clear. Okay, and then you say, look, there is something different about non-essential goods. I tend to believe it. I tend to believe it. We tend to believe that, you have money, you buy an Armani suit. If you don't have it, you buy a cheap suit. Okay, so you can do that.
So those results you showed with the finite classification was with the same data?
What they have. Oh. Yes. No, I didn't run any regression, if that is your question, Martin. No.
It's taken from their paper.
Yes, I searched all the appendix.
I'm so disappointed. I thought you produced
no
responses overnight.
No. Believe me. Okay. So, and again, I think this came during the conversation. We tend to believe that this non-essential component is important, and I believe the story. I tend to believe it. That, some goods you are going to cut in the non-essential. But it seems to be, to me, more than a story but within sector. Okay, that I don't know if you can do it with the data. Okay, so suppose you can buy salt. Salt is essential. But if you have money, maybe you buy the expensive salt, right? You buy the Himalayan salt. And if you need clothes, I could come here without clothing, but it's essential, right? But if I have more money, I buy more expensive clothing, right? And that is what I try to adjust. It's inside sectors, maybe it's not across sector. And using this methodology across sector is sort of complicated. And finally, I know that the one helped with the model. I spend a lot of time thinking about that. The point is it's so complicated. There are many things, because you start to think about sectors, there are many effects that you have to think on the pricing. In general equilibrium, you have to think how the prices are set across the sector, what are the different markups, how you can substitute labor from one sector to the other. That's going to be very important here. Because do you need a model? Maybe not. I think there is an interesting point. And I love models. I do models for everything. But I'm not orthodox. I believe sometimes you don't need a model. You just have to make an empirical point. And I think the point is what I was telling you. I do believe in this story that the non-essentials are important. There is something special. But you have to make the point clearer, neater. Because if you send the paper, they are going to immediately tell you, well, what is the durable, what is the difference with other mechanisms? Okay? Maybe you do a model, that's what you want to do. You want to compare a model with durables and equal goods, and another model with non-durables, but with different elasticity of substitution, and see what is the difference reactions, what is the different thing that you get. I'm on time? Yes. Okay.
Provided you stop.
Yeah, I'm stopping.
Yes, there's one point. The second point regarding durables, we know actually that monetary policy effects can go the other way around. Actually, people can front load the purchase of durables. That's the deal on the dull paper in the numeric address, because it depends on the persistence of the path of the interest rate. So it could go actually the other way around. The other thing is this finding that is very robust about the fact that low-income people tends to increase the hours worked through strong income effects. And that goes back to the production factor, I think, that you are using, that is very stark. Now, going back to the nuclear plant example, nuclear plants need cleaners too, right? So actually, in all these sectors, you have very different workers working there, and you have both low skilled and high skilled. And yeah, I don't know if that can explain the difference of the results between Ferroni and Dalpaper and yours.
Thank you. So just briefly, there's quite a lot in there. I think.
You want to answer piecewise, or?
Yeah, take a few questions.
No, it's a very short question. I see very well the microeconomics of what you have presented. What I see not so well is the macroeconomics importance and what is at stake macroeconomically behind your distinction. I see very well your analysis where you are going from macroeconomics, monetary policy toward non-essentials and essentials, but I don't see the macroeconomic dimension of the problem when I see very well the microeconomic one.
If I can give myself some time. At the end of the day, the whole discussion confused me a little bit because you have three distinctions. One is durable versus non-durable, and we know it's very important for business cycles because durables are much more volatile than non-durables, and furthermore, they could potentially generate, deterministic cycles because if you have a stock of durables which is too high following a boom, then the demand falls, right? Everybody has a car, and then you have a distinction between, that's what Tobias said, intertemporal high versus low intertemporal elasticity of substitution. And if we think about essential durables, we might think, okay, they are essential, but because they are durable, they can have a high intertemporal elasticity of substitution, right? They have a vacuum cleaner, this is essential, but I can keep it for 20 more years, especially if it's made in East Germany or something like that. And then we have essential versus non-essential, which is yet another distinction based on, non-homotheticity and income elasticity, right? So if you had a model where all goods have the same intertemporal elasticity of substitution and the same durability, but different income elasticity, essentials versus non-essentials, which is not possible so far with your formulation, I think, as long as, again, utility is time separable, right? But you need a more complicated utility function. But then if you had such a world, then what would you get in terms of predictions for business cycle? And presumably, you might think that if shocks are permanent, like trans-stationary shocks, then there is little room for intertemporal elasticity of substitution because the shocks are permanent after all. But then they might have an effect, a differential effect between essential and non-essential. So maybe the distinction between essential versus low intertemporal elasticity of substitution is there when we think about the persistence of shocks. When shocks are very persistent, then what matters is whether you are essential as opposed to substitutable.
Thank you. I'll just very briefly respond, given I don't want to eat into the next presenter's time. Firstly, thank you very much, Facundo, to the discussion. That's really, really helpful points, and we'll think a bit more about how to flesh out this durables issue. I think one of the things that we were thinking about is that the labour market aspect is a little bit more distinct in the durables. I think maybe we might need to do a bit more.
Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah.
I apologize. I used to work in the construction sector, right? And the construction workers are low skilled, so you know that you have a shock affects the construction, maybe you have that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Construction's difficult in this. Yeah. So thank you. We'll take on board those comments. On the quality suggestion, we were thinking about extending this to scanner data, which has the greater granularity that we'd be able to then distinguish on quality, which we can't really do within the types of data that we've got already. And yeah, I think we just need to think a bit more about this hours working aspect of the low-income households, particularly because within our earnings evidence, we've got a mixture of both wage and earnings because we're using weekly earnings. And other points well taken. I think we need to think a bit more about it. On the micro versus macro importance, I think this was where hopefully our model might be able to flesh this out a little bit more, because at the moment from the empirical evidence, we don't as distinctly see this amplification from the low-income workers. It's more like an implication of a series of different empirical facts, where the macro model might be able to more distinctly show, like, separately what the amplification channels are. But yeah, well taken. This doesn't necessarily like conclusively show that yet. And we haven't really thought much about your points about permanent shocks, and I think that's really, really helpful because, as you say, that does then draw the distinction between the intertemporal elasticity and IED. In general, I think I just need to think a lot more about what you said, and if you had time to discuss after, that would be brilliant. But points well taken, and thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much.